Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Another episode of the online history of the family in the 18th and 19th century, and we are in the 19th century already. Probably it's time to talk about the royal family and especially the family of Queen Victoria. The family and the monarch who defined the age, who gave her name to the age. Before the jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in British history, surpassing the 60 years reign of her grandfather George III, the Mad King. So he didn't really celebrate this long reign because his health was very bad towards the end of his life. Victoria ruled for more than 63 years, and this would really mean like 3 generations. When she died, most of the subjects did not remember any other monarch. So this is a very long period and a long reign, and especially if we look at the situation of private life and family life, this is like 3 generations of people. So we can basically divide the history of Victoria into 3 parts. So Victoria the maiden, Victoria the wife and mother, and Victoria the widow. So if you remember our discussion on the royal family in the 18th century and the period of the Regency, so the problems that both King George III and the country, the parliament, had with the royal princess. Victoria came to the throne after a long period of very dramatic dynastic crisis. So the royal princess failed to produce legitimate offspring. They were very careless with spending the public money on their private pleasures. They had mistresses. They were basically considered immoral. And if you remember the dramatic story of the failed divorce of George IV, this may indicate that the climate, the social climate, was already changing when Victoria was born and she was growing up. The general belief was that the royal family should try to be the model family for the subjects. And in the 19th century, after the French Revolution, after the reforms of the first decades of the 19th century, the subjects that had the most to say were the middle class. We'll talk about the Victorian values and the middle class next week. So today let's start with Queen Victoria, after whom those values are named. Was Victoria Victorian? Well, depends when, really. Definitely not in her early youth, not in the first years of her reign. She was, as you may remember, the daughter of one of the younger brothers of George IV. So after George IV died leaving no heir, his younger brother William took the throne and he ruled for another couple of years as William IV, again having similar problems, not leaving children to take the throne. By that time, Victoria was already born. She was born to Edward, the Duke of Kent, and his German bride, the widowed Duchess Victoria, also called Victoria. But when the future queen was just a toddler, her father, the Duke of Kent, caught a chill, which went very badly, so he died. She was a half orphan. Her mother was German, but she believed, and the entire family, including her mother's brother Leopold, you may remember the story about Princess Charlotte. This was the unhappy widower who would never now be the nominal king of Britain. He was asked in the early 30s to become king of the Belgians. The new country, Belgium, was forming and they were looking for a new monarch, so they found this man. He was very happy to accept. He married again, he married a French princess, but he remained Victoria's favorite uncle Leopold. He also believed that his sister should stay in Britain with Victoria. They lived in Kensington Palace. However, the relationship between Victoria and her mother was very strained and sometimes quite distant. One of the reasons was that her mother had a close friend, an advisor, and a rumored lover in the person of Sir John Conroy. He was a minor nobleman, but basically he was like the private secretary to the Duchess, so to the Queen's mother. He was remembered by Victoria as an unpleasant, bullying, greedy man who tried to domineer her mother and even Victoria herself. The ultimate goal of Conroy and also the Duchess of Kent was to ensure that Victoria would get to the throne as a very young person, so there would be another regency. And of course, the mother of the Queen would be the natural candidate to be the next regent. Victoria yearned to be independent. She didn't like this idea. She flatly refused to sign any documents making it possible for her mother to become the regent. She had the backing of her uncle William, King William, who didn't like his sister-in-law very much, who was very rude to her publicly, which was an unusual thing really in the aristocratic circles, so the enmity must have been very strong. And during one of the dinners at the royal court, King William told the Duchess of Kent that he intended, being an old and ill man as he was, he intended to live as long as at least to Victoria's 18th birthday, so when she inherited the throne, there would be no regency. And he managed to do that. He outlived Victoria's 18th birthday just by a few weeks. And one morning, early in the morning in Kensington Palace, Victoria was woken up and informed that her uncle died, so now she was queen. She was kept by her mother away from the royal court, so she started her reign with a degree of sympathy, of positive emotions from her subjects. She was very young, she was very tiny, she was a very short woman, below 1 meter and 50 centimeters tall. In her youth she was rather slightly built. Later on she had a tendency to put on weight, so she was quite overweight. Well, 9 pregnancies wouldn't show that, if nothing else. But she was full of good intentions, and she was really yearning to be independent. And the first person she could really rely on was her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. You may recall, I mentioned him already, he was the widower by that time, and his wife was one of the scandalous women of the Regency period. Her name was Lady Caroline Lamb. She used to be one of the many lovers of George Byron, and apparently after he broke up with her, she lost her mind and she basically died insane. The poor husband, betrayed husband, loved her so much that he cared for her nevertheless. By the time Victoria became Queen, Lord Melbourne was the leader of the Whig Party, one of the two parties in Britain. There were the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories were more conservative, the Whigs were a little bit more liberal. They would later, in the 19th century, develop into the Liberal Party, but at the beginning of Victoria's reign they were still called the Whigs. Lord Melbourne became Victoria's mentor. Some say he was like a father that she never had and always wanted to have. Some say, some versions of this story suggest even some sort of romantic attachment and at least a mutual fascination between the very young queen and the much older politician. I strongly encourage you to Google Victoria and to see what you can find about her. There are different films and TV series that tell the story of Victoria's life. If you're interested in Victoria's cultural presence, I have written a book on that. It's in Polish for the foreigners in the group, so. But the speakers of Polish can just look up the book I wrote on that. There was quite a successful film quite a while ago called The Young Victoria. This was a feature film about the early reign of Victoria. Then there has been, it hasn't finished yet, a multi-season TV series called Just Victoria. So if you start from the beginning, you will see the early years. Victoria was learning fast. She nevertheless committed a few errors early in her reign. She once overthrew a government when she was only 19 because after the general election, the Whigs, led by Lord Melbourne, lost the election, so there should be another government, a Tory government. The leader of the Tory party, Sir Robert Peel, should become the next Prime Minister. And as it was done, as it was the convention for ages, really, at least since the 18th century. When the new government was formed, there was also the change in the royal household, and the ladies of the court were changed, so the wives and daughters of the losing party, in this case the Whigs, would be replaced by the wives and daughters of the winning party, namely the Tories. Of course, women were not even able to vote, let alone sit in government, but this was seen as some sort of political nominations, but of course not by Victoria. Victoria, when approached by Sir Robert Peel, the leader of the Tories, with the proposal to change some of the ladies of her court, said she just refused. She said, they are not politicians, they are my friends, I'm not getting rid of any of them, even one. So poor Robert Peel said, I'm sorry madam, I cannot form the government if I do not have your trust. And Melbourne was back in power for a couple of years, 2 more years I guess. Then there was another general election and the Whigs lost again, and this time actually Melbourne himself persuaded Victoria to obey the political rules and to change her ladies. But this shows you that she was not a docile woman. She was quite strong-willed. This was something that she always had. She had a very strong character. She could be quite bossy, and she could strike terror in her assistants throughout her life. So she was not a submissive young woman, but rather quite a spirited one. So now we move to the next question, namely Victoria's marriage. So part 2, Victoria is a freshly crowned monarch, and of course everybody knows, except for Victoria perhaps, because she believed that she would be like Elizabeth I and she would be the next Virgin Queen. Because she wanted to be independent. She really wished for that. But everybody else, including Lord Melbourne, knew that she really needed to marry. She needed to have children, especially after this long crisis with inheritance. She really needed to produce an heir. So first she needed a husband. But being a monarch, she could not be ordered by anyone, including her closest relatives, to marry a candidate of their choosing. So what happened was a very interesting situation, because on one hand you might say that Victoria chose Prince Albert herself. She chose him because she fell in love. This was a love match. On the other hand, however, if you dig a little bit deeper, you will observe that this was, in a way, also a somewhat arranged marriage, and the choice of the candidate, Victoria's first cousin, his father and her mother were brother and sister. This wasn't such a free choice as Victoria believed. So Albert was carefully selected, mostly by Uncle Leopold, and for quite a long time he was groomed to become the best partner, the best assistant to Victoria as a woman and also as the Queen. Victoria kept a diary all her life. She started keeping the diary when she was 13, and she continued until just a few days before she died. Unfortunately, large sections of this diary did not survive. They were destroyed by Victoria's daughters on the orders of Victoria herself, unfortunately. So towards the end of her life she might have been seen as a Victorian character, so rather prudish. So the diaries were censored. But in the early years of Victoria's life, so the years which include the beginning of her great love for Albert and the first years of marriage, the diaries are more or less complete. So we have the account of the meetings, we have the account when they meet after a few years separation, during which Albert was educated. He completed a grand tour of Europe, so he was a cultured man. He was a very ambitious, very hard-working young man, so he submitted himself to the regime of education and development and also sporting activities. He was quite athletic in his youth as well. Just the kind of education that he believed and his uncle, their mutual uncle Leopold, believed would make him attract Victoria's attention, and it worked like magic. When Victoria saw Albert after a few years break, she fell in love almost instantly. In her diary she writes that he was beautiful, and she underlines the word like 5 times and puts 7 exclamation marks or something. So she was smitten. Then she had to propose marriage. Yes, she was a woman proposing marriage to a man, but she was also the reigning monarch. This was after her coronation. This was absolutely against court protocol for anyone to propose to the queen, so she had to do that. She wrote about it in her diary. She was shy. She was quite timid, but she did it, and they were married, and they started the family. Victoria was very much afraid of childbirth. You must remember the story of Princess Charlotte, who died in childbirth, and Victoria dreaded that this situation might be repeated in her case. So she hoped that she and Albert, we know from her diary, of course she did not write directly, but we know from her diary that she really enjoyed the wedding night and the sexual side of their union. So she was not Victorian in this sense as being completely sexless, rather opposite. But she hoped she would be spared maternity for a while. Unfortunately for her, she probably got pregnant on this wedding night. So exactly 9 months later, the first child was born, the first of 9 to come. And this was Princess Victoria, called Vicky by the family, who would later become the Empress of Germany, of unified Germany. Then, as I said, 8 more children would follow, 5 boys and 4 girls, if I'm not mistaken. Definitely the second one was the boy, the Prince of Wales, future King Edward VII. What kind of family life did Victoria and Albert have? This is an interesting question because on one hand, this was the new world, the new society, and to attract the support of her middle class subjects, Victoria had to become what is sometimes called the middle class queen. So the model family, the model wife, the model mother to her children. Privately, and we know it from her diaries and letters, especially letters to her eldest daughter after she grew up and went to Germany. Privately, Victoria didn't really like small children. She was not moved by babies. She believed that they were ugly. She believed that maternity was something that took the woman away from her husband, and she, being so much in love with Prince Albert, really wanted to spend time with him rather than with those children. So she was rather unhappy in her maternal role, but of course she had to put up the public face. And if you look at the illustrated press, if you look at the portraits, the family portraits especially, you see a lot of images of Victoria with her children, the whole family together, the children playing, Victoria behaving like a good, obedient wife, and a very engaged, loving mother. This was really the public relations, which worked very well, which really made Victoria a very popular monarch, especially at that time when the family was growing. However, privately, she was still more concentrated on Albert, and she was quite interested in the political matters. Of course, she was a constitutional monarch, so she didn't have much to say, but she wanted an active role. So she tried to use her power to warn, to advise, to have a say in political matters. Luckily for her, Albert was also very interested in that, and after some years, because initially she tried to keep him away from political matters. But after those pregnancies, when the family was growing, when they had 5, 6, 7 children, Victoria really started to allow more political say to Albert. She even arranged for the parliament to give him a special title, the Prince Consort. He was never called king. She wanted him to be king consort. The parliament did not agree. They agreed to call him Prince Consort, but only after several years of marriage. He was very hardworking and hardworking man, and very interested in modernity. So whatever was new, whatever was modern, like the railways and all the social changes in Britain, he was very much interested in that. His greatest achievement probably was the very idea and the organization of the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. This was the first ever, you might say, World Trade Fair. Massively popular, millions of tickets were sold. This was a massive success also financially. If you go to London and you see the so-called Museums Quarter with the Victoria and Albert Museum, this is really, and the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum and Royal Albert Hall, so this whole quarter in Kensington. So the ground and the buildings and everything were bought and built on the profits of the Great Exhibition. So Albert wanted really to convince the British subjects, and perhaps even Victoria herself, that he was useful, that he was not just a foreign poor prince whose only function was to father all those children. And if we look at the 50s especially, they worked like a very good team, and this probably contributed to the period of peace and prosperity in Britain, and even international problems such as the Crimean War in the 50s or the Indian Revolution, the Indian Mutiny, also in the 50s, in 1857, did not really produce a big crisis in Britain itself. So now on to part 3.